Hey, okay, so I'm on. Yes, that's my talk. I have like 43 slides to do in 10 minutes, so that's a challenge for, let's see whether I will make it. Does anyone know consumer-driven contracts? Yeah, one person, so he will probably not learn anything new. And anyone knows microservices, or does microservices, okay? So then I'm wondering how you are testing your interactions if you don't know the consumer-driven contracts. And yes, my talk is what, why, and how. And basically, the seminal text was done in 2006, so it's not a new thing. But in the lately years, it started to become more popular. And I would like to start with why. So let's get into a case where the CDC could actually help you. And imagine you have this scenario, so you have a producer, that's a service, and you have a consumer, and we are in this microservice environment, and it's an enterprise. I put there the note that it's an enterprise because the service and its API is not a public, so it's private. And we have a team 1 and team 2, that's important as well, while the whole thing is also about the communication. And it's worth to note that there are different teams that actually take care of the services, right? And of course, the producer wouldn't be there if the consumer wouldn't need him, right? So the consumer calls the producer, it does some service and replies some answer. And this can happen. And it actually happens that the consumer calls the producer, something changed, the consumer didn't know about it, and actually the endpoint doesn't exist and doesn't return any data. Or it actually returns the data, but in a format that the consumer didn't expect, or just isn't what he would like to have. And believe it or not, this actually really happens, and I'm currently dealing with this while I'm working with my client, so I'm really talking from the trenches. And yeah, on the producer side, there is a producer contract. That's the little thing up there, and that's define what the producer does. So that's your schema. That's your swagger, right? So it defines what the producer does, what are the endpoints, descriptions, and blah blah blah. And the consumer-driven contracts is that the consumer provides the contract to the producer, and this contract says what actually are the expectations of the consumer and what the consumer would like to have from the producer. And the consumer provides this file to the producer, right? And you can have multiple consumers that use the same service, and then you can have multiple consumer contracts. And in what form that those contracts can exist, right? Because we are now a little in an abstract form, and it can be as simple as a text. So just simply idea is that the consumer team writes an email to the producer team like, we need your service to do this for us. And they have some form of, okay, they at least told us what they expect from us. Or it can be Groovy JSON or YAML file or whatever, some machine-readable files. Or I like this one, unit test. So the consumer team actually clones the repository of the producer, and the consumer team writes a unit test in the producer code that actually calls those endpoints that they would like to have and record the expectations in that unit test. So that's an interesting one. I really like that one. And this is an example of a contract. It's written as a Groovy file, so you can see, maybe you cannot see, but it defines that the endpoint we would like to call is a fraud check. The method is put, and it should have this kind of body, and if I call it with loan amount that big number, that's 100,000 minus 1, I expect that the fraud would actually return me status fraud and blah, blah, blah. And that is provided by the consumer. So these are the expectations from the consumer. If I call you, you give me this. And we now have this nice setup, right? So we have a producer, it has its contract and the consumer contracts. And what can it tell us? So this is a big bubble, and imagine this is the producer contract. So this is all the services and all the functionality that the producer actually provides, right? And the consumer contract should be, in theory, and like in good case, a subset of all of those functionalities, right? So this is the service 1, this is the service 2. You probably see where I'm going, and this is the service 3. And what's like suspicious here? Anyone? What's suspicious? Yeah, it's outside. But not only that, there are actually 2 interesting points. So one is outside, so the consumer's expectations are out of what the producer can provide. And here in the middle, you can see that that's the, let's call it the most valuable part of the service, because it intersects between different consumers. So this is the functionality that actually is used the most. So we have, yes, these 2 points, but let's don't forget about the rest. What could be the rest? Okay, that was just the question. And that's either what is not used at all, right? So the services and functionality that is not used, or it was just recently added. So it can be used, and no one is using it yet. And this is our perfect world. And what CDC should help you to provide to actually help you to not have is this state. So if suddenly a producer changes something and it's out of the consumer's expectations. Now, how do we reach this state? You have to apply the contracts. So you have the contracts, and now you have to apply them somehow. And you can do it by using some frameworks. So here, these are 2 most popular. I was working with. Actually, yes, you can do the consumer-driven contract tests, right? So you create the tests based on those contracts, and there you use the frameworks. So I'm familiar with Spring Cloud Contract. There is also Pact, and the idea here is to fail fast. So the producer would know when developing already. On a developer's machine, that I break someone's contract. So it wouldn't go up to the integration tests or even to the end-to-end tests, right? So the idea is to fail fast. And this is the typical testing pyramid. So to make sure the interaction works, you have the integration tests or end-to-end tests. And integration tests, usually there are stubs used, right? But now the question is, who writes those stubs? So there would be a stub for a producer that the consumer can use, and that stub is sometimes written by the consumer team, which is an issue, because they have no idea if the producer changes, the stub doesn't change. And to make sure that the whole integration works, sometimes the integration, the testing pyramid looks like this, and on some projects like this. So there's so many end-to-end tests that actually it's super time consuming. So if you change something, it can take 20 hours to run the whole suite of end-to-end tests, right? So if you use one of those frameworks, what they can offer you is this simple flow that the consumer provides the contract to the producer, and based on that contract, the unit tests on the producer side are generated. Let's assume they just proposed that we need a new API. new endpoint, and that endpoint isn't there, so the tests will fail in this case. And then, after the producer team actually fixes the tests, so they create the new endpoint, at that point, the build would run, the test would pass, a stub would be generated based on that contract, so that's like your single point of reference to what the service should do. And those stubs could be used for testing on the consumer side. So the tests on the consumer side wouldn't go against the stubs that were created by some team, but against the stubs that would be generated by the framework, and the stubs would be generated based on the contract. So both teams are looking at the one file, which actually is helpful, and I like this part because I think it's a platform for discussion between the two teams. And many times in like the organizations that try to do microservices, there are different teams, they don't like each other, they don't talk too much each other, but this could be a platform because here when the consumer proposes the contract to the producer, it's not like it should be forced to do it that way. They just create a pull request with the contract, and now the discussion can start. Can we supply this contract? Does it make sense? Does it comply with our data that we have? And the discussion can be there. So I really like this part, that the whole thing is a platform for discussion. And yeah, that was my lightning talk.